The ScareCity crew decided to continue their quest for Appalachian Trail action by trekking from the Delaware water gap Mt Minsi to Route 309 in Pennsylvania. From tallest to shortest we have Clint, Neil, Dan, and Kate, hoofing the 50-mile stretch of some of the most rocky, scenic, and dry sections of the Appalachian Trail. Being more of the tourist-type hikers, we have heavier packs and cover less ground than the typical thru hikers. The rockiness of the trail can be described as anything from rocks sticking out of the ground so much that there is no flat ground to put your foot on, to boulder fields that make ascents and descents 5 times as difficult. So 9 miles a day ended up being the most miles we completed in a day. A guy named Mun saved the water situation. With so many dried up springs, we could have been in bad shape, but he kept jugs of water at just about every gap for hikers to stay hydrated. The trail was absolutely challenging to say the least, but the views were worth every bit of the struggle. We started on a Saturday around 11 a.m. at the bottom of Mt Minsi in the Delaware National Water Gap. It was about a 2-mile trek up the 1,000-foot elevation gain of Minsi to the ridgeline. We came across many scenic overlooks along the way that gave us grand views of Mount Tammany on the other side of the gap and the Delaware River itself. We then moved on to views at Tots Gap and Lunch Rocks. The ridgeline had a fire road, but it was often flooded in the middle. The views along the way allowed us to look back and see Tammany, Minsi, the gap, and the ridgeline we had just walked. When we arrived at Kirkridge Shelter, we made use of the water available at the spigot above the shelter. Beyond the shelter, we found a view at the power lines. We crossed Fox Gap and soaked in a setting sun at Wolf Rocks. We ended up covering about 9 miles our first day and camped at the first site we found in the middle of the woods. Our second day began with limited overlooks. Mun helped us out with some water jugs stashed at the bottom of the trail at Wind Gap. After crossing the road and going under an overpass, we ascended the other side of Wind Gap. We scored some views after crossing the 500-foot elevation change on both sides of Wind Gap that stretches over a 2-mile distance. Later we found an amazing campsite with a view about 9 miles from our starting point of the day. We were able to soak in great views from the setting sun well after establishing camp and feeling at home. The next day we were able to witness the valley covered in fog and the process of the fog moving out of the valley from a bird's eye perspective. Day 3 was a day of hiking the ridgeline and attempting to take it a bit easy after 2 days at 9 miles apiece. We came to some power lines that delivered great views just before finding Leroy Shelter. We were just over 2 miles into our hike. The only reliable spring was about 0.4 miles down a steep trail from the shelter. It was literally a hole in the ground, but we were excited about getting some fresh cold water. We tallied about 6 miles for the day, just past Smith Gap, and found a cozy site, barely off the trail, just past the gap. Day 4 brought us views at an overlook, power lines, and Little Gap, a 300-foot change in elevation on both sides over a mile stretch. We put in about 8 miles to get to, down, and back up the other side of Little Gap. With the huge task of Lehigh Gap still ahead of us, we decided a site just off the trail with tons of space, as well as multiple other sites hidden behind it through more trails, would be home for the evening. Day 5 was filled with views, starting with a clearing at power lines and frequently occurring all the way to Lehigh Gap. The power lines had a pile of boulders under them, creating a great 360-degree view. We got the chance to look back and see the ridge we had walked yet again. The ridge of Lehigh Gap is a boulder field that ends very steeply at the gap. The views of the Slatington, Walnutport, and Palmerton area just can't be beat. We stopped for quite a while looking out over the gap and then began our steepest descent of the trip. The trail descended 1,000 feet over a 1-mile stretch. Just past the boulder field of the ridgeline, we had to climb down on all fours through a cliff-like area. Once down in the parking lot, we took a good long break. We decided to order Domino's, and Clint promptly devoured an entire pepperoni pizza before ascending the other side of Lehigh Gap. The other side of Lehigh Gap is 1,000 feet over a 2-mile stretch going back up. We dubbed this the Lehigh Gap Challenge. We also met a hiker named Smokey Beard, who brightened our Domino's break with trail conversation. On the way up Lehigh Gap, we were able to refill on water at a spring just before the George W. Outer Bridge shelter. We ended up taking a scenic offshoot of the Appalachian Trail for 2 miles to continue the theme of soaking in the views. We were able to see the Pennsylvania Turnpike Northeast extension from above before sleeping above it about 2 miles later. We completed about 7 miles this day before being lulled to sleep by the Jake-breaking 18-wheelers. The site was adequate, a bit rocky, but we enjoyed the rest. Day 6 was a scenic and trying day, a day filled with the rocks we had grown accustomed to, as well as large cliff structures overlooking the surrounding area. A few views led up to the Lehigh Furnace Gap on the Southern Trail. The Southern Trail was hardly a trail, as it was mostly boulders, but it did offer some great views. After crossing Lehigh Furnace Gap and getting more water from our buddy Munn, we took a break at Bake Oven Knob Shelter. The trail then led us to Bake Oven Knob. The site of an old Air Force beacon and an excellent overlook. The cliffs are covered in graffiti, but the location and views are hard to beat. We then moved on to the boulder cliffs of Bear Rocks. We all dropped our bags for this climb to a view well deserved. After Bear Rocks, we came to the Knife Edge, which seemed like a never-ending stretch of trail that was literally on the edge of rocks, forming super steep cliffs on both sides. This was definitely one of the most epic obstacles of the trip. Then we hoofed it out to the New Tripoli campsite, a very cushy and spacious site with a spring about 100 feet down the trail from the site. After 8 strenuous miles, we were happy to see sleep on grass. Day 7 started with a long walk up the hill out of the New Tripoli site. We had views at the power lines and later on at a fire pit. We had put our work in earlier in the trip, so we only had 2 miles left to get to PA Route 309 for pickup. Kate's mom met us in style with a minivan for transport and moon pies from the local Aunt G's Pastries for celebration. Despite blisters, bruises, dried tears, and upchucking, the crew had recharged their passion for life by experiencing the struggles of hiking such a challenging section of the Appalachian Trail. Life doesn't seem so hard after a challenge such as this one. I guess that's why they call it a hiker's high.